I never expected to be standing under a broken streetlight at 38, feeling like I was 17 again. The metal fixture above me flickered with the erratic rhythm of something dying slowly, casting intermittent pools of yellow light across the cracked asphalt behind the gymnasium. Each time it sputtered back to life, my shadow would stretch long and distorted before disappearing again into darkness. The alumni basketball game had ended an hour ago. Most people had filtered out through the main doors, their voices carrying across the parking lot in waves of laughter and half-remembered stories. Car engines started and faded, headlights sweeping across the building's brick facade before vanishing down the main road. The town grew quiet the way small towns do after an event. Suddenly, completely, as if everyone had simply evaporated back into their separate lives. I should have left with them. Should have said my goodbyes to my brother, kissed my mother on the cheek, and driven the 2 hours back to my apartment where everything was predictable and safe. Instead, I found myself walking toward the back of the school, drawn by some instinct I couldn't name. The cold bit at my face, sharp enough that each exhale formed small clouds that dissipated almost immediately. February in this part of the state was unforgiving, the kind of cold that settled into your bones and stayed there. The gymnasium loomed beside me, its windows dark now, except for the emergency lighting that cast long rectangles of pale illumination across the ground. I could still hear the echo of the game in my mind, the squeak of sneakers on polished wood, the hollow bounce of the basketball, the crowd's collective intake of breath during close shots. It was the same sound I remembered from high school, when I used to sit in the bleachers pretending to care about sports while really watching the players move with an intensity that made my chest tight. Footsteps approached from behind me, deliberate but unhurried. I knew the rhythm before I turned around. Some sounds burrow so deep into memory that 20 years can't erase them. Julian stopped about 10 feet away, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a navy wool coat I didn't recognize. He was broader now than he had been in high school, his shoulders filling out the coat in a way that spoke of years of physical work. His hair was darker, or maybe there was just the inadequate light, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we were teenagers. But his posture was the same, that careful stillness he used to carry himself with, as if he were always measuring the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. We stood there in the flickering light, neither of us speaking. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the conversations we'd never had and all the moments that had passed unmarked. I could hear the distant hum of traffic from the main road, the occasional creak of the buildings settling in the cold, the whisper of wind through the bare branches of the oak trees that lined the school's perimeter. Julian's breath was visible in the air between us, small puffs that appeared and vanished like thoughts he couldn't quite voice. His eyes were darker than I remembered, or maybe that was the shadows. In high school, I used to catch glimpses of him in hallways, always surrounded by teammates or friends, always moving with that easy confidence that came from knowing exactly where you belonged. He never looked at me directly then, but sometimes I would catch him in my peripheral vision, and I would wonder if he was looking back. The gymnasium's heating system kicked on with a mechanical groan, the sound carrying across the empty lot like a sigh. Julian shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and I noticed he was wearing work boots, scuffed and practical. His hands moved slightly in his pockets, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like he was bracing for something. I wrapped my arms around myself, less from the cold than from the sudden awareness of how exposed we were standing there. The parking lot felt enormous and intimate at the same time, a pocket of space carved out from the rest of the world. The street light continued its irregular dance, and each time it flared to life, I could see Julian's face clearly, the sharp line of his jaw, the way he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The wind picked up, sending a few dead leaves skittering across the pavement between us. Julian took a step closer, and I could smell his cologne, something woody and understated that seemed to match the way he carried himself now. It was different from the sharp, aggressive scents I remembered the boys wearing in high school. This was quieter, more deliberate. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. His jaw worked slightly, like he was testing words before letting them out. The silence grew thicker, more charged, until it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I found myself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the gravity of whatever he was trying to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than I remembered, roughened by years and cigarettes and conversations I hadn't been part of. The words came out barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid the night itself might overhear. "Kiss me already, just don't tell anyone." The words hit me like cold water, sudden and shocking. They hung in the air between us, visible almost like his breath had been moments before. I felt my body go completely still, every muscle freezing in place as my mind tried to process what I had just heard. The streetlight flickered again, casting his face in sharp relief before plunging us back into near darkness. 20 years collapsed into nothing. I was 17 again, sitting in the school library during lunch, watching Julian walk past the windows with his teammates, wondering what it would feel like to have someone like him notice me. I was 17 and lonely and desperate for connection, for touch, for someone to see me as more than just the quiet boy who spent his time with books instead of people. But I was also 38, standing in a parking lot in a town I had left behind for good reason, looking at a man who had just offered me something I had dreamed about as a teenager while simultaneously asking me to keep it secret. The contradiction felt like a weight in my chest, heavy and sharp. I stared at him, this man who had been a boy when I last knew him, who had grown into someone I recognized and didn't recognize at all. His eyes were fixed on mine, and I could see the vulnerability there, raw and immediate. It was the same look I remembered from that night behind the bleachers senior year, when we had almost, but hadn't, crossed a line that neither of us was ready to cross. The heating system groaned again, and somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. The ordinary sounds of a small town settling into evening, but they felt impossibly far away. Julian and I existed in this bubble of flickering light and shared history, suspended between the past and whatever came next. I didn't move. Not yet. I couldn't trust myself to move, couldn't trust what I might do if I stepped forward or what it might mean if I stepped back. So I stood there, frozen in the space between desire and caution, between the boy I had been and the man I had become, waiting to see which one of them would decide what happened next. To understand why I was standing in that parking lot, you have to understand the life I had built in the spaces between wanting and having. My apartment in Cedar Falls was exactly what you would expect from someone who had spent 20 years learning to be careful with hope. 2 bedrooms, though I only used one. A kitchen table for one. Bookshelves that lined every wall, filled with other people's stories because they were safer than examining my own. I worked at the public library downtown, a job that suited the person I had become after leaving this place. There was something comforting about the predictable rhythm of it. The quiet morning hours before the building opened, the familiar weight of books in my hands, the way patrons would nod their thanks and disappear back into their own lives without expecting anything more from me. I helped people find what they were looking for, and then I went home to my orderly apartment where everything had its place. Dating happened, but infrequently and always with the same careful distance I maintained with everything else. There was Marcus, who taught high school English and talked too much about lesson plans. David, who managed a coffee shop and had strong opinions about fair trade practices. A few others whose names have blurred together in the gentle forgettability of relationships that never quite took root. They were good men, decent men, but something in me always held back. Something that whispered that this was temporary, that real life was somewhere else, waiting. I told myself I was content. Contentment seemed like a reasonable goal for someone like me, someone who had learned early that wanting too much led to disappointment. My mother called every Sunday, asking the same questions about work and whether I was eating enough vegetables. My brother sent photos of his kids, their faces gap-toothed and grinning in ways that reminded me of our own childhood. I had constructed a life that was peaceful and solitary and sustainable. The alumni game had not been part of the plan. My brother had mentioned it casually during one of our phone calls, the way he mentioned everything, as if it were no more significant than the weather. Their old coach was retiring, and they were having a ceremony. Mom wanted to go. Wouldn't it be nice if I came down for it? Just for the weekend. It had been so long since we were all together. I almost said no. The drive was 2 hours each way, and I had a stack of books to catalog, a routine that would be disrupted by the trip. But something in my brother's voice, some note of hope I recognized from when we were children, made me agree. One night, dinner with the family, sit through a basketball game, drive home the next morning. Simple. I should have known that nothing about returning to this town would be simple. The gymnasium had felt smaller than I remembered, cramped with folding chairs and the ghosts of every awkward moment I had endured within those walls. The ceremony was brief, speeches about dedication and building character, the retiring coach standing at center court with tears in his eyes. I sat with my family, watching young men in their 50s shake hands and slap backs, remembering when it had seemed impossibly adult to my teenage self. That was when I saw Julian for the first time in 20 years. He was sitting 3 rows ahead of us, his dark hair now touched with gray at the temples, his shoulders broader beneath a simple button-down shirt. He turned at one point, scanning the crowd, and our eyes met for just a moment. He nodded, polite, distant, the kind of acknowledgement you give to someone whose face you recognize but whose name you might not remember. Except I could see in his eyes that he remembered my name perfectly. Julian Reeves had been everything I was not in high school. Star of the basketball team, homecoming king, the kind of person teachers remembered fondly and classmates talked about years later. He dated cheerleaders and drove a truck his father had bought him and moved through the hallways with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. We existed in entirely different orbits, intersecting only in the brief moments when fate or coincidence threw us together. There had been exactly 3 conversations between us in 4 years of high school. The first was junior year, when we were paired together for a chemistry lab and spent 45 minutes trying to identify unknown compounds while making stilted small talk about weekend plans. The second was at a house party senior year, when I had found myself pressed against the kitchen counter while Julian reached past me for another beer, his arm brushing mine for exactly 3 seconds before he disappeared back in a crowd. The third conversation happened behind the bleachers on a night in April, 2 weeks before graduation. I had been walking home from drama club practice when I heard someone crying, quiet, muffled sobs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I found Julian sitting alone in the grass, his face buried in his hands, his varsity jacket thrown carelessly beside him. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and for a moment we just stared at each other. His eyes were red. His face streaked with tears, he wiped away quickly with the back of his hand. I should have kept walking, should have pretended I hadn't seen him at his most vulnerable. Instead, I sat down beside him in the grass and asked if he was okay. We talked for 2 hours that night. About college, about leaving, about the weight of expectations that felt impossible to carry. He told me he was scared. I told him I was scared too. When he walked me home afterward, we stopped at the end of my driveway and stood there in the darkness, and I could feel something shifting between us, some possibility opening up like a door neither of us was brave enough to walk through. Nothing happened. We graduated 2 weeks later and went to different colleges and built separate lives in separate cities. But I never forgot the way he looked at me that night, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time, like maybe in another world we might have been something to each other. That night behind the bleachers had never really ended for me. Even as the years passed, and I convinced myself I had moved on, it remained like a song you can't get out of your head. Always there, just beneath the surface of whatever else I was doing. I had built my careful life around the absence of that moment, around all the things that almost happened but didn't. After the ceremony ended and the crowd began to thin, I should have said goodbye to my family and driven home. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Keep visits brief, keep connections manageable, keep the past safely in the past. But as I stood near the gymnasium doors, watching people filter out into the cold February night, Julian appeared beside me, as if he had been waiting. He looked different up close than he had from across the gymnasium. The years had settled into his face in ways that made him more interesting rather than less. Lines around his eyes that spoke of time spent outdoors, a small scar near his left temple that hadn't been there in high school, hands that were calloused from work I couldn't imagine. He wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, clothes that seemed chosen for comfort rather than impression. "So you came back," he said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite identify. Not surprise exactly. Maybe recognition. "Just for the night," I told him. "My mother wanted to see the ceremony." He nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd around us, as if he were looking for someone or making sure no one was looking at us. It was a gesture that felt familiar, though I couldn't place why. Right. That makes sense. We stood there in the awkward space that opens up when two people who share a history have run out of safe small talk. Around us, families gathered coats and car keys. Teenagers complained about being dragged to an old people's basketball game. Couples discussed where to go for late dinner. The ordinary chaos of an event ending, but it felt distant, like we were watching it through glass. "You still living up in Cedar Falls?" Julian asked, though something in the way he said it made me think he already knew the answer. "Yeah, still at the library." "That's good. That's really good." He paused, his hands fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket. "I always thought you'd end up somewhere like that. Somewhere quiet." There was something underneath his words, some current I couldn't quite read. In high school, Julian had been easy to understand, confident, popular, always moving toward the next thing with purpose. This version of him seemed more careful, like he was measuring each word before letting it out. My brother caught my eye from across the lobby and waved. I lifted my hand in response, a gesture that meant I saw him, that I would be along in a minute. Julian followed my gaze and nodded toward where my family was gathering. "You should go," he said, but he didn't move away. Instead, he seemed to be studying my face as if he were trying to memorize something. "How long are you staying?" "I leave tomorrow morning." Something shifted in his expression then, so quickly I almost missed it. Disappointment, maybe, or something deeper. Right. Of course. Early drive back. The lobby was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers and the custodial staff beginning to stack chairs. My mother appeared at my elbow, her purse clutched in both hands away. She always held it when she was ready to leave. "Nathaniel," she said, then noticed Julian and smiled the polite smile she used with people she recognized but didn't really know. "Julian, isn't it? How nice to see you." Julian straightened slightly, some echo of the boy who had always been respectful to adults. "Mrs. Rivers, good to see you too." My mother looked between us, her expression curious but not prying. "Are you two catching up? That's lovely." She patted my arm. "Take your time, honey. Your father's getting the car warmed up." She walked away, leaving us alone again in the nearly empty lobby. The custodian was turning off lights now, section by section, and the space was growing darker around us. "I could give you a ride," Julian said suddenly. "If you want. I mean, if you're not in a hurry to get back to your parents' place." "I don't need a ride," I said, though even as the words came out, I knew I was going to accept. "I know." He was looking at me directly now, and I could see something in his eyes that reminded me of that night 20 years ago, that same vulnerability barely held in check. "But maybe we could talk for a while. Catch up properly." So I found myself in the passenger seat of Julian's truck, a newer model Ford with work tools rattling in the bed and the faint smell of sawdust and coffee lingering in the cab. He drove slowly through the quiet streets of our hometown, past houses where porch lights were coming on and families were settling in for the evening. We talked about safe things at first. His work as a contractor, mostly residential renovation projects. My job at the library, the satisfaction of helping people find what they needed. The weather, which had been unusually cold for February. His parents, who had moved to Florida 3 years ago. The carefully neutral conversation of two people who were remembering how to be around each other. But as we drove, circling the small downtown area where most of the shops had closed years ago, something began to shift between us. The conversation grew quieter, more personal. Julian mentioned that he had never married, said it like a confession rather than a simple fact. I told him about the apartment in Cedar Falls, about the routine I had built there, and somehow made it sound lonelier than I had intended. We ended up parked behind the school, engine running for heat, talking about people we had known in places that no longer existed. Julian's voice grew softer as the night deepened, and I found myself watching the way his hands moved when he talked, the same graceful gestures I remembered from when he was 18. There was something he wasn't saying, I could feel it in the pauses between his words, in the way he would start a sentence and then change direction. When I asked him directly why he had never left town, why he had stayed when so many others had gone, he was quiet for a long time. I almost did, he said finally. Had a scholarship to state. Everything was set up, but something kept me here. What? He turned to look at me then, and in the dim light from the dashboard, I could see that same expression he had worn behind the bleachers all those years ago. The same fear, the same longing, the same careful hope. You, he said. The memory of you. The memory of you. Those words hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to take back or ignore. I stared at Julian in the dim light of the truck's cab, my heart doing something irregular and painful against my ribs. 20 years collapsed into nothing, and I was 17 again, sitting in the grass behind the bleachers, feeling like something momentous was about to happen. So when Julian whispered those words under the flickering streetlight, "Kiss me already, just don't tell anyone," I understood that this moment had been building for 2 decades. That every careful conversation, every stolen glance, every night I had lain awake wondering what if had been leading to this parking lot, this broken light, this man standing close enough that I could see my own reflection in his eyes. I moved toward him without deciding to move. My body made the choice before my mind could catalog all the reasons it was complicated, all the ways it could go wrong. Julian met me halfway, his hands coming up to frame my face. And when our lips touched, it was awkward and desperate and perfect in the way that first kisses between men who have waited too long always are. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, long enough for me to taste the coffee he had been drinking, to feel the slight tremor in his hands, to realize that this was really happening after all these years of wondering. When we broke apart, Julian laughed, a sound caught between relief and disbelief. "I should have done that 20 years ago," he said, leaning back against the side of his truck. His face was flushed, his breathing uneven, and I could see something in his expression that looked like wonder. I wanted to tell him that I had been waiting 20 years for him to do exactly that. Wanted to say that every relationship I had tried to build since leaving this town had been measured against the ghost of possibility he represented. Instead, I stood there in the flickering light, trying to process the fact that Julian Reeves had just kissed me behind the high school gymnasium. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text message. "Julian, coffee? If you're not in a hurry to get back." I should have been in a hurry. I had told my mother I would leave after breakfast, had a stack of work waiting for me at home, a routine that would be disrupted by staying longer. But I found myself sitting across from Julian in the only coffee shop downtown that was still open on Sunday mornings, watching him fidget with his cup and wondering if the kiss had been real or something I had imagined. He looked different in daylight, more solid somehow. The shadows that had made him mysterious the night before were gone, replaced by the ordinary reality of a man in his late 30s wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, his hair still bearing the imprint of his pillow. But when he looked at me, I could see the same intensity that had driven him across that parking lot. We talked about everything except what had happened. The weather, which was supposed to warm up later in the week. The coffee, which was better than either of us remembered. The changes downtown, how half the storefronts were empty now, how the young people all moved away after graduation. Safe territory, the kind of conversation you could have with anyone. But underneath the words, something else was happening. Julian's foot would brush against mine under the table. His eyes would linger on my mouth when I was talking. Small gestures, barely noticeable, but they carried the weight of everything we weren't saying. When I finally said I should head back, Julian walked me to my car. We stood there in the parking lot of the coffee shop, the winter sun weak but warming, and I could feel the same tension that had been building the night before. "Would you maybe want to take a drive?" he asked. "Before you go? There's this place I used to go when I was a kid. Might be nice to see it again." I should have said no. Should have gotten in my car and driven the 2 hours back to my orderly apartment and my predictable life. Instead, I found myself following Julian's truck out of town, down country roads I half remembered from high school, to an abandoned park where we had sometimes gone for parties when we were teenagers. The park was smaller than I remembered, just a few acres of winter-brown grass and bare trees surrounding a pond that was frozen solid. There was a picnic table near the water, weathered and covered with initials carved by generations of local kids. Julian parked near the entrance, and we walked down to the pond together, our breath visible in the cold air. "This is where I used to come after practice sometimes," Julian said, "when I needed to think." "About what?" He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the frozen water. "About you mostly. About what I was feeling and why I couldn't talk about it." We sat on the picnic table, our shoulders touching, and Julian began to talk about the years since high school. How he had tried dating women the way he was supposed to, how he had almost gotten engaged once to a girl everyone said was perfect for him, how he had broken it off 3 days before proposing because he couldn't stop thinking about that night behind the bleachers. I listened, recognizing the careful way he chose his words, the pauses where he decided what was safe to say. It was the same caution I heard in my own voice when people asked why I had never settled down, why I always seemed to be holding something back. As the afternoon wore on, Julian's rules began to emerge, spoken and unspoken. We could meet like this, in places where no one would see us. We could talk, could touch when we were alone, but how to stay private. His business depended on his reputation in this town, his standing with the men he worked with, the families who hired him. He couldn't afford to be seen as different, couldn't risk losing everything he had built. I found myself nodding along, agreeing to conditions that made my chest tight with a familiar ache. It was the same feeling I had carried through high school, the same sense of making myself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for someone like me. But Julian's hand was warm in mine, and when he looked at me, I could see 20 years of longing in his eyes, and I told myself that something was better than nothing, that this hidden thing we were building might be enough. For the first few days after I returned to Cedar Falls, I told myself that what had happened with Julian was enough, that stolen moments and careful text messages and the promise of seeing him again soon could fill the space that had been empty for so long. I went back to work at the library, cataloged returns, helped patrons find what they were looking for, and pretended that nothing fundamental had shifted in my world. But Julian's presence had settled into my daily routine like a new frequency I couldn't tune out. He texted in the mornings before I left for work. Simple messages, nothing that would seem inappropriate if someone else saw them. "Hope you slept well. Thinking about that coffee shop. The weather's supposed to be nice this weekend." Messages that carried more weight than their words suggested, each one a small reminder that I was no longer carrying this feeling alone. I found myself driving back to town the following weekend without really deciding to. Julian had mentioned that he was working on a house renovation near the old downtown, said it casually, like he wasn't suggesting anything. But when I arrived Saturday morning, he was waiting in the coffee shop parking lot, leaning against his truck with 2 cups from the place across the street. We spent the day together, carefully, a drive to the next town over where no one would recognize us. Lunch at a diner, where Julian knew the owner wouldn't ask questions about who I was or why we were together. A walk through a state park where the trails were empty because of the cold. Hours of conversation that felt both intimate and guarded, like we were learning to dance around the shape of what we couldn't say out loud. It was the following Tuesday when everything began to unravel. I had driven down after work, telling myself it was just to see him, that we could grab dinner and I could drive back that night. Julian had suggested meeting at the diner on the edge of town, the same place we had gone the weekend before. I arrived first and took a booth near the back, somewhere we could talk without being overheard. Julian walked in 15 minutes later, but he wasn't alone. 3 men followed him through the door. Workers from his crew, I realized, recognizing the same work boots and worn jackets that Julian wore. They took a table near the front, their voices carrying across the restaurant, as they complained about a difficult client and joked about weekend plans. I watched Julian settle into the booth with them, watched him laugh at their stories and order the same burger he always ordered. Watched him become someone I barely recognized. Louder, more aggressive in his gestures, participating in conversations about women and sports and which bars had the best deals on beer. It was a performance so complete that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined everything that had passed between us. When he finally noticed me sitting in the back, our eyes met for just a second. I saw recognition there, and something else, panic, maybe, or fear. He gave me the same polite, nod he might give any casual acquaintance, then turned back to his co-workers as if I were no more significant than any other patron in the restaurant. I sat there for 20 minutes, picking at a sandwich I couldn't taste, watching Julian exist in a world where I didn't matter, where what we had shared was so thoroughly hidden that it might as well not have existed at all. When I finally left, he didn't look up. That night, he called me after 10 o'clock, his voice low and apologetic. "I saw you at the diner," he said. "I wanted to come over, but what, Julian? You know why? Those guys, they work for me. If they thought we were, if they saw us together like that, it would raise questions. Questions about what? About why you were having dinner with an old classmate." He was quiet for a long time. "You know, it's not that simple." Doi, because from where I was sitting, it looked pretty simple. "It looked like you were ashamed to be seen with me. That's not fair. You don't understand what it's like here. Why I have to maintain. Then explain it to me." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him choosing his words. "I built something here, Nathaniel. A business, a reputation. These people, they trust me to work on their homes, to be around their families. If they thought I was different, that would all disappear. Different." The word hung between us like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples in every direction. "Is that what we are, Julian? Different? You know what I mean." But I didn't know what he meant, and that was the problem. I understood exactly the fear he was describing, because I had lived with it too, had spent years learning to navigate a world that had no space for men like us. The difference was that I had eventually decided to stop hiding from it. When I didn't respond, Julian's voice grew smaller, more desperate. "I can't lose everything here," he said. "This town, this life, it's all I have." I stared out the window of my apartment, at the lights of a city where I could walk down the street holding another man's hand without fear, where I could be myself without measuring every word and gesture, where I had built a life that was honest, even if it was sometimes lonely. "Then you're asking me to lose something instead," I said finally. The silence that followed felt like a door closing. Julian's breathing was ragged, and I could hear something that might have been crying, though he tried to muffle it. "I don't know how to do this any other way," he whispered. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 20 years pressing down on both of us. The boy who had cried behind the bleachers, the man who had kissed me in a parking lot, the stranger who had pretended not to know me in a crowded diner. They were all the same person, trapped in a cage he had helped build and didn't know how to escape. "I know," I said, "and that's the problem." The conversation ended without resolution, the way difficult conversations often do when neither person knows how to bridge the distance between what they want and what they can have. Julian said he needed time to think. I said I understood, though I wasn't sure I did. We hung up with the careful politeness of two people who had suddenly remembered they were strangers. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold while I stared at my phone, waiting for it to ring again. Waiting for Julian to call back and say he had figured it out, that he had found a way to want me, without conditions. But the phone stayed silent, and eventually the sun came up, and I went to work and pretended that nothing had changed. 3 days passed without contact. Then a week. I told myself this was probably for the best, that whatever we had been building was too fragile to survive in the real world anyway. But the silence felt like a physical weight, pressing down on me every time I walked past my phone or caught myself listening for the sound of text message. When Julian finally called, it was late on a Thursday night. I was already in bed, reading a novel I couldn't concentrate on, when his name appeared on my screen. "Can we talk?" he asked without preamble. "In person, I mean. This weekend." I should have said no. Should have told him that I needed more than stolen conversations and hidden meetings, that I was tired of loving someone who could only love me back in shadows. Instead, I heard myself agreeing to meet him Saturday afternoon at the state park where we had walked the weekend before. I arrived first and waited by the frozen pond, watching my breath cloud in the cold air. When Julian appeared on the trail, he looked like he hadn't been sleeping either. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who was holding himself together by force of will alone. We sat on the same picnic table where we had talked before, but this time the silence between us felt different, heavier. Like we both knew this conversation would determine whether what we had built could survive or whether it would join all the other almost that had shaped our separate lives. I've been thinking about what you said, Julian began, about asking you to lose something. And he was quiet for a long time, staring out at the frozen water. I realized you were right. What I'm asking isn't fair. But he didn't sound like someone who had come to offer a solution. He sounded like someone who had come to explain why there wasn't one. This town, he continued, his voice so low I had to lean closer to hear him. It's all I know. My business, my clients, the guys who work for me. They're not just my livelihood. They're my identity. I don't know who I am without that. I understood what he was trying to tell me, had seen it coming in the careful way he chose his words. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. So what are you saying? I'm saying I'm not ready. To be seen. To risk everything. He turned to look at me then, and I could see tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. I'm saying I'm a coward. The word hung between us like an accusation, though I wasn't sure if he was making it against himself or expecting me to make it against him. I had spent so many years being angry at men like Julian, men who had the luxury of choosing invisibility, who could pass through the world without the constant vigilance that came with being obviously different. But looking at him now, I could see that his closet wasn't a luxury at all. It was a prison he had built so carefully that he couldn't find the door. I spent that night at my childhood home, sleeping in the same room where I had dreamed about boys like Julian when I was 17. My mother made breakfast the next morning and asked if I was feeling all right, said I looked tired. I told her I was fine, but sat at the kitchen table where I had done homework and eaten countless meals, surrounded by photos of a life that felt both mine and not mine. There is a picture on the refrigerator of my brother and me at his high school graduation, both of us grinning at the camera with the unconscious confidence of boys who believed the future would be whatever they wanted it to be. I stared at that photo for a long time, remembering the boy I had been before I learned to be careful with hope, before I understood that love could be something you carried alone. I called Julian that afternoon and asked him to meet me one more time. He suggested the park again, but I told him no. If we were going to have this conversation, we were going to have it honestly. In town, where people might see us. Where his choice would have to be real. We met at the coffee shop where we had sat just 2 weeks earlier, though it felt like months had passed since then. Julian looked nervous, his eyes scanning the room as he sat down across from me. There were only a few other customers, an elderly couple sharing a newspaper, a woman with a laptop, a teenager doing homework. People living their ordinary lives, unaware that they were witnessing the end of something that had taken 20 years to begin. I looked at Julian across the small table, at this man I had wanted for so long that wanting him had become part of who I was. He was still beautiful to me, still carried himself with that careful grace that had caught my attention in high school. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the way he flinched every time someone new walked through the door. If we do this, I said quietly, we do it fully, or I leave. Julian's face went very still. What do you mean fully? I mean no more hiding, no more pretending we don't know each other, no more rules about who can see us together or where we can go. I mean you decide whether you want to be with me enough to be honest about it. He stared at me for a long time, and I could see him weighing everything he would have to give up against everything he might gain. The calculation was written across his face like an equation he couldn't solve. I'm not ready for that, he said finally, his voice breaking on the words. I nodded, though something inside me shattered at the confirmation of what I had already known. Then I'm not ready to keep hiding. Julian put his hands over his face, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I wanted to reach across the table and touch him, to offer some comfort for the choice he was making. But comfort would have been a lie, would have suggested that what we were ending could somehow continue. When he looked up, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know, I said, and meant it. So am I. I walked out of that coffee shop without looking back, though I could feel Julian's eyes following me to the door. The afternoon air was sharp against my face, cold enough to make my eyes water, which was a small mercy. I got in my car and drove the 2 hours back to Cedar Falls in complete silence. No music, no radio, just the sound of the engine and my own breathing and the weight of what I had just chosen. My apartment felt different when I walked through the door. Smaller, Maybe, but also more solid. More mine. I set my keys on the kitchen counter, the same counter where I had stood talking to Julian on the phone just days earlier, and realized that something fundamental had shifted. The space no longer felt like a place I was hiding. It felt like home. I didn't check my phone that night. Didn't wait for Julian to call or text. Didn't torture myself wondering if he might change his mind. Instead, I unpacked the small bag I had brought for what I thought would be just another weekend visit, hanging my clothes back in the closet with the methodical care of someone reclaiming his life. The next morning was Sunday, and I did something I hadn't done in months. I went for a walk through downtown Cedar Falls without a destination in mind, without checking the time or worrying about who might see me or where I needed to be next. I walked past the coffee shop where I sometimes bought my morning cup, past the bookstore where I occasionally browsed on weekends, past the small park where couples sat on benches and children played on swings. There was a man walking a golden retriever who smiled at me as we passed. A woman tending to the plants outside her flower shop who nodded good morning. A teenager on a skateboard who called out thanks when I stepped aside to let him pass. Ordinary interactions with ordinary people, but they felt different somehow. Lighter, like I was present in my own life in a way I hadn't been for years. I thought about Julian, of course, about the way he had looked when I walked away, the tears in his eyes, the words he couldn't say. But the sadness I felt was clean in a way that surprised me. It wasn't the complicated grief of losing something I had never really had, but the simpler sorrow of letting go of something that couldn't grow. The phone did ring 3 days later. Julian's name on the screen while I was eating dinner at my kitchen table, reading a book about urban planning that had nothing to do with love or loss or the choices we make when we're afraid. I stared at the phone for 4 rings, then let it go to voicemail. I listened to the message an hour later, standing in my kitchen window with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. Nathaniel, his voice said, rough with something that might have been tears. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I wanted you to know that you were right. About everything. And I'm sorry I couldn't be brave enough to choose you. There was a long pause, the sound of him breathing, maybe composing himself. I hope you find someone who can love you the way you deserve, he continued. Without hiding, without shame. You deserve that. You always did. The message ended there, and I deleted it without saving it. Not because I was angry, but because I understood that holding on to it would be another kind of hiding. Another way of living in the space between what was and what might have been. Spring came early that year, and with it a restlessness I hadn't felt in a long time. I started taking evening walks that stretched longer and longer, exploring neighborhoods I had never bothered to learn. I bought coffee from different shops, tried restaurants I had been meaning to visit for years, said yes when coworkers invited me to movies and book clubs and dinner parties. One evening in April, I was walking through the Arts District when I passed a small gallery opening. Through the windows, I could see people holding wine glasses and talking quietly in front of paintings hung on white walls. A man about my age stood near the door, glancing at his watch as if he were waiting for someone. When our eyes met through the glass, he smiled. Not the polite nod of a stranger, but something warmer, more curious. I found myself slowing down, then stopping, then walking through the gallery door without really deciding to. His name was David, and he was a photographer whose work was featured in the show. We talked about composition and light, about the way cities change when you pay attention to them, about books we had both read and places we wanted to travel. The conversation flowed easily without the careful editing I had grown used to, without the constant awareness of what I couldn't say. When the gallery closing was announced, David asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. Not hiding behind casual suggestion or coded language, but directly, honestly, the way people do when they're interested in each other and see no reason to pretend otherwise. I said yes and meant it. Walking home that night, I passed under the same streetlights that had lit my path for years, but everything looked different. The shadows fell the same way. The buildings stood in the same places, but I moved through it all with the quiet confidence of someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. At my apartment, I stood at the kitchen window where I had listened to Julian's voicemail months earlier. The view was the same, other apartments, other windows, other lives being lived behind glass and brick. But I wasn't looking for something I couldn't have anymore. I was simply present in the life I had chosen, in the truth I carried openly, in the possibility of love that didn't require hiding. I touched my lips briefly, remembering that kiss under the broken streetlight, the way it had felt like an ending and a beginning at the same time. Then I let my hand fall, turned away from the window, and went to bed, ready for whatever came next.